Hi everyone. So my paper and infographics are on the lack of diversity and anti-intellectualism within the GOP. The US electorate is becoming increasingly divided by race and education. As the country is becoming more diverse and educated, the Republican Party is heading in the other direction. My target audience for this paper and the following infographics is anyone within the Republican Party. My purpose for creating these infographics is to convince Republicans that they should give more attention to the needs of non-white and highly educated voters. Some Republicans may be biased and resistant to these suggestions, believing that there's a conspiracy in higher education to convert students into Democrats. Others may not want to cater to the needs of our racially diverse population and may not believe that racial diversity is important. However, it's clear that the U.S. is trending towards more racial and ethnic diversity and higher levels of educational attainment, so if the GOP doesn't change with the times, they will continue to lose support and therefore will lose power. Nationally, the U.S. grew by 19.5 million people between 2010 and 2019, a growth rate of 6.3%. While the white population declined by a fraction of a percent, Hispanic, Asian American, and Black populations grew by rates of 20%, 29%, and 8.5%, respectively. That translates into Hispanic populations contributing 10 million people, over half the nation's growth, Asian American residency growing by 4.5 million, Black residents contributing 3.2 million, and persons of two or more races growing by 1.7 million. The 2010 to 2020 decade would be the first decade since the first census was taken in 1790, when the white population did not grow. The Democratic Party is far more diverse than the Republican Party, which, considering the national trend, does not bode well for the future of the GOP. Only 17% of the GOP is non-white compared to 40% of Democratic registered voters. White non-Hispanic voters lean more Republican by a large margin, 53% to 42%. Conversely, the Democratic Party has a huge majority of the non-white vote. 83% of Black voters lean Democratic compared to only 10% who identify with the Republican Party. 63% of Hispanic voters identify or lean toward the Democratic Party, while 29% identify or lean toward the GOP. The Democratic Party also has a sizable advantage over the GOP in lean party identification among Asian American voters, with 72% who lean toward the Democratic Party compared to just 17% who lean toward the Republican Party. The changing educational makeup of the electorate. In 1996, only 24% of registered voters in the U.S. had a college degree compared to 35% today. Conversely, the number of voters with a high school degree or less has fallen from 48% to 33%. The number of voters with some college but no degree has only increased slightly from 27% to 33%. In 1996, 22% of Democratic voters had a college degree in comparison to 27% of Republican voters. Higher education was once more closely associated with Republican Party affiliation, but over the past 25 years, higher education has become exceedingly affiliated with the Democratic Party. In 1994, 39% of those with a four-year college degree and no postgraduate experience identified with or leaned toward the Democratic Party, and 54% associated with the Republican Party. Today, those figures are inverted, with 53% of those with a four-year college degree affiliated with the Democratic Party, while 40% are affiliated with the Republican Party. Democratic gains have been even more pronounced among those who pursue postgraduate education. In 1994, those with at least some postgraduate experience were evenly split between the Democratic and Republican parties. Today, the Democratic Party enjoys a roughly 2-to-1 advantage in leaned partisan identification. Lastly, the GOP has made gains with those with only a high school diploma. From the late 1900s to the early 2000s, 47% of high school educated voters were affiliated with the GOP and 45% were affiliated with the Democratic Party, compared to today, with 48% identifying with the Republican Party and 44% identifying with the Democratic Party. The following is my infographic process. In all of my infographics, I attempted to reduce as much of the cognitive load as possible by eliminating extraneous elements. I got rid of all grid lines and borders except for in the party affiliation based on educational attainment infographic, where lines dividing the 4 charts were necessary. According to the Gestalt principle of closure, when one looks at an image that has parts missing, their brain naturally fills in the blank spaces. Therefore, it's often not necessary to include chart borders because people will usually see a chart as cohesive without them. I also eliminated the axes and opted for data labels where applicable. I used color very sparingly. The base color used in every infographic was gray. Using gray helps the less important elements of the infographic to fade into the background and allows for the greatest amount of contrast against other colors. I used a bold red for everything Republican and a bold blue for everything Democrat for obvious reasons. When considering the visual order of elements within my infographics, I followed Baranato's and Knaflich's formatting recommendations. Baranato suggested that the title should take up about 12% of the page, the subtitle should be 8%, visual field 75%, and the source line 5%. In terms of alignment of elements, I opted to have everything aligned to the left. This creates 1 point of alignment, which limits eye travel. Whereas center justification creates multiple alignment points for elements that could share 1. Most of the data I found from the Pew Research Center and from the US Census Bureau. I imported the data into Google Sheets to create the basic charts. I then copied most of the charts into Photoshop so that I could further customize them. I've broken down my process for each chart. For the party affiliation percentages based on level of education infographic, I decided to use a stacked bar chart for this data because it felt like it best illustrated the percentages of people within each party as part of a whole. I chose to make this bar chart horizontal as opposed to vertical because the horizontal charts look better with long category names. I placed the postgraduate category on top to highlight the most important element of the chart. This is that people with the highest level of education are overwhelmingly affiliated with the Democratic Party. The race and ethnic growth in the U.S. from 2010 to 2019. To illustrate the trend towards more diversity in the U.S., I initially used data that compared percentages of each racial or ethnic group over time. However, the white population has consistently remained the majority, so this data did not illustrate my point as well as I would have liked. When I switched to the population growth totals instead of population percentages, the decline in white population growth was much more visually pronounced. I chose a horizontal bar chart because I felt the data labels within the bars of the chart fit best in a horizontal format. GOP holds edge in affiliation among white voters but fares worse among other groups. This started out as a standard bar chart, but I wondered if there might be a better way to display the information. I tried a bunch of different chart types in Google Sheets, and when I stumbled upon the stepped area chart, I knew I found the perfect solution. With the Republican percentages placed on top of the Democratic percentages instead of having them side by side, it's much easier to directly see the stark contrast between the two parties. So these are both of my line graphs. One is the sharp rise in level of education in U.S. from 1980 to 2019, and party affiliation based on educational attainment. When charting many data points, line graphs tend to be less cluttered than bar graphs. Line graphs utilize the Gestalt principle of connection. When items are connected, they are seen as part of a group. In the sharp rise in level of education in U.S. graph, I decided to use gray for the high school or less category because the statistic remained fairly constant compared to the other two categories. This helped to highlight the most important data in the chart, which was the dramatic rise in educational attainment of some college or four-year degree. In closing, it's clear that the U.S. is continuing to diversify and to pursue higher education. If the Republican Party does not give more attention to the needs of non-white and highly educated voters, they will lose power and will become increasingly irrelevant. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you have a really lovely break. Thanks.